Over the past 20 years, the TNA title has been one of the most prestigious prizes in all of wrestling. But how did it get to this point? Well, that's exactly what we're looking at right now in the history of the TNA World title. It all goes back to 2007, a full 5 years after TNA had first formed. Why are we starting so relatively late in the game here? Well, because for the first 5 years of its existence, the promotion started by Jerry and Jeff Jarrett had been an official National Wrestling Alliance affiliate. So that meant, like with places such as Jim Crockett Promotions, World Class Championship Wrestling, Mid-South Wrestling, and the Continental Wrestling Association back in the day, all of their major belts would be the ones with the NWA branding. Yes, when early TNA shows had world title matches, it would be the NWA World's title the competitors in those matches would be fighting over. And that meant the National Wrestling Alliance were technically the ones calling the shots when it came to who would be able to win their officially sanctioned gold. Obviously then, this created a bit of a headache for TNA bosses as they were never in full control of the top prize on their own show. Sure, this kind of thing might have been normal during the territory days, but come the 2000s, the territory days were long over, and with TNA trying to establish themselves as a solid number 2 in the North American wrestling scene here, they really needed more autonomy over their own product. How would this problem ultimately be resolved? Well, after the likes of Ken Shamrock, Ron Killings, Jeff Jarrett, AJ Styles, Ray Gonzalez, Raven, Rhino, Christian Cage, Sting, and Abyss had all held the gold during the first half of TNA's existence, the brand began to feel more firmly established as new owners. The Carter family helped to stabilize things from a business sense. And this would be doubly true once Kurt Angle joined the company in 2007 and took it to what, to this day, might remain its high point in terms of critical acclaim. Really then, it was clear here that this was the best possible time for Impact to branch out on its own and become a completely independent body. So that's exactly what they did when on May 13th of that same year, they formally seceded from the National Wrestling Alliance. But while this might have been a good thing for TNA in terms of them gaining complete independence over the booking of their own shows, it did create a problem in that it meant, effective immediately, the NWA would no longer recognize then-champion Christian Cage. Now, as soon as the split between the two parties occurred, the Instant Classic would be stripped of the title as he was an Impact contracted guy. Obviously then, this meant Dixie Carter was going to have to create a new belt that the men in her company could go after, and this was what led to the introduction of the TNA World title. How would the TNA World title be received by fans back in 2007? Pretty well, as it was seen as just another sign of the company's growth. And in an interesting wrinkle, it would also be able to keep a claim to that lineage going all the way back to George Hackenschmidt in 1905. Of course, the way TNA did this involved a little bit of subterfuge, as it meant they'd have to, without the permission of the National Wrestling Alliance, continue to advertise Christian Cage as the NWA World's Heavyweight Champion during his match against Kurt Angle and Sting at May 13, 2007's Sacrifice pay-per-view. That's right, because the winner of this match would be crowned the inaugural TNA World Heavyweight Champion. It meant that when Kurt Angle came out the winner, he'd have technically won the new gold by beating the NWA World Champion. That said, even if he was the champ now, this wouldn't be a reign which lasted for long. No, as the result of the controversial finish of that three-way bout where Angle tapped out Sting while Sting was technically pinning Angle, then on-screen authority figure of TNA Jim Cornette would hold the belt up as being vacant. So now, with there being no champion only one day after the belt had been created, it was imperative that Impact crown a new one as soon as possible. And this was something they'd immediately set about doing as a 5-man King of the Mountain match was announced for Slammiversary in June. Who would be in this match? Well, while Sting would not get a spot for some reason, Kurt Angle would, and he'd also be joined by Samoa Joe, AJ Styles, Christian Cage, and Chris Harris. In the end, however, none of these other 4 men would be able to overcome the Olympic hero, because once was all said and done, he'd be calling himself champion for the second time. Why the need for all this confusion if the belt was only going to end up right back on Kurt Angle again? Well, that was never fully clarified, though there are a few possible explanations, one of which is that, with Vince Russo still writing the show here, the whole thing was just another one of his trademark attempts at creating Crash TV. But while there is probably some truth to this, the more interesting theory is that it was all done to try and appease the National Wrestling Alliance by attempting to create a buffer between Christian Cage's NWA World title run and Angle's TNA World title run, thus giving the former governing body of the industry a stronger claim to that lineage. Whatever the truth, the end result was the same, and that end result was that now going forward, Kurt Angle was the official TNA World Heavyweight Champion. And this was a belt he would hold proudly for the better part of the next year, as the very fact he was in possession of it, right when Impact was hitting its high watermark in terms of acclaim, really helped to add a lot of legitimacy to the prize. Sure, there would be that brief 2-day period where Sting beat him for the gold in October of 2017 and then immediately dropped it back again. We were still talking about a Vince Russo book show after all. But for the most part, this would be the Pittsburgh native's gold, and things would remain that way all the way up until April 13th, 2008. What happened on this day to change the landscape of the world title picture in TNA? Well, this would be the point that Samoa Joe finally beat Angle to win the gold for himself during a fantastic steel cage match, which served as a high watermark of their absolutely stellar feud. And in doing so then, Joe added even more legitimacy to the top prize. As well, he'd never been in WWE or anything, he was arguably the best wrestler in the world back in 2008. Hell, it had been his 645-day-long run with the Ring of Honor world title back in 2003 and 2004, which had really put that belt on the map. So with him and Kurt Angle holding this still relatively new piece of hardware in back-to-back reigns, it signaled that it was something which had importance to the larger wrestling world. And that feeling of importance surrounding the TNA World Heavyweight title would continue to grow as the rest of the decade played itself out, because after Samoa Joe's reign ended at 180 days, Sting would get a proper one of his own, which lasted for even longer at 182 days. Then, after Mick Foley got a short run in mid-2009, the belt would finally pass over to the ace of the promotion, the man who'd already held the NWA World's title but had, up until that point, never held TNA's own top prize, AJ Styles. Yes, now that Styles and Joe had both won the title, it felt like it was fully legitimized and was going to be an increasing force to be reckoned with over the next decade to come. Unfortunately, though, it would also be around this time that things started taking a downward turn for Impact as a whole. What caused this downward turn? Well, in late 2009, Eric Bischoff and Hulk Hogan were brought on board to serve as the new creative heads of the Nashville product. And rather than continue to try and present TNA as an alternative to WWE, their idea was to strip it of all its identity and transform it into something which was more WWE light. That's right, gone were things like the six-sided ring here. And as if that wasn't bad enough, also largely gone were the days of people like AJ Styles and Samoa Joe being pushed as the faces of the company and the ones worthy of holding the top prize. Instead, what we got was a lot more ex-WWE stars coming in with a lot more WWE-style angles in the main event scene, and this would all have a very negative effect on the way the lineage of the TNA World title went over the next year or two. Sure, it wasn't as if ex-WWE guys hadn't held the TNA title prior to that. When you're talking about the only major league out there, it was inevitable that this was going to happen, as most of the top talent to have come around since 2001 had worked in WWE at some point. But prior to 2010, for every Mick Foley or Kurt Angle who could call themselves champion, there were Impact originals like the aforementioned AJ Styles and Samoa Joe who felt like they were paving the way of the future for the promotion, a future which was TNA's own and not someone else's. Once Bischoff and Hogan took full control, however, the lineage of the gold started looking very different, as between April of 2010 and February of 2011, it went from Rob Van Dam to Jeff Hardy to Mr. Anderson and back to Jeff Hardy again, with Hardy here giving us the horror that was his own personalized, immortal version of the strap. Hell, even when Sting won it in February of 2011, it felt different to the runs he'd had before, as now it felt less like he was being given the belt because he represented the spirit of the then present-day alternative to WWE, and more because Eric Bischoff was trying to relive the success of the Monday Night Wars. Come on now, this was around about the time that Eazy-E and the Hulkster very briefly chose to move Impact to a live slot on Monday nights directly opposing Raw, a move which quickly proved to be a disaster and which caused TNA to have to retreat back to Thursdays a mere 2 months later. Really then, if anything was clear come the summer of 2011, it was that TNA needed to freshen things up and try to regain their original identity, especially when it pertained to the legacy of their world title. Unfortunately though, the way they chose to do that here didn't do too much to help, as it mainly involved them officially changing the name of the company to Impact Wrestling and further getting away from what the brand once was. So you would expect this meant the TNA World Heavyweight title would change its name too now, but that wouldn't happen for a while yet. No, for the time being, it would continue to keep the TNA branding, as throughout the remainder of 2011, James Storm and Bobby Roode helped to bring a little bit of that original energy back when they became first-time champions on October 18th and October 26th, respectively. And that bringing back of the original energy would continue somewhat during 2012, as this was when Austin Aries first won the belt and held on to it for a full 98 days. That said, come the close of the year, things would be right back to the new normal, as Jeff Hardy claimed the gold for his own again. Sure, in some ways this brought more eyeballs to the product, so it could be argued that it was a good thing in that sense. But the real problem remained that the new eyeballs who were being brought in here weren't seeing TNA as the alternative it had been originally intended to serve as. Rather, they were seeing something entirely different, a lesser version of WWE which was always going to look inferior when compared in that way. Would 2013 bring any significant changes for the top prize down in Nashville? Kind of, as this would be the point that the Aces and Eights angle took over the main event scene. And as anyone who was watching at the time will remember, this was when Bully Ray fully ascended to the level of main event guy in Impact Wrestling by winning the gold for himself. But he wouldn't hold the belt for the entire year. No, after executing Option C in July by giving up his X Division title in exchange for a shot at the more prestigious gold, Chris Sabin would also get a brief run on top. And by the time the winter was dawning, AJ Styles would once again be the guy on top of the mountain too. And this would lead to one of the more notable storylines surrounding the TNA World Heavyweight title during that time period, the storyline in which, after legitimately being on the verge of leaving the promotion in the wake of a dispute over a new contract, AJ Styles left Impact while still in possession of the belt. Sure, the whole thing was all a retread of the Summer of Punk angles from both Ring of Honor in 2005 and WWE in 2011, but it was fun to see it play itself out at another promotion regardless. And it all hit its apex when, after AJ was formally stripped of his championship on October 29th, a tournament would be held to crown a new champ, a tournament which was ultimately won by Magnus, aka current SmackDown General Manager Nick Aldis. And wouldn't you know it, once Magnus had the belt in his possession, AJ Styles would reappear to claim that he was still the real champion, as he'd never been beaten for it. As you would expect then, this led to a final showdown between the two, a final showdown which was eventually won by the Englishman. Why had AJ lost here? Well, because he was legitimately leaving the company. That's right, with TNA in financial difficulty by then as the Carter family started growing frustrated over the lack of return on their initial investment, many of the people who had come to define the Impact Zone in years prior would disappear around this time. We're talking about names like Samoa Joe, Sting, Jeff Jarrett, Christopher Daniels, and of course, the Phenomenal One himself. So going forward, none of those people would hold the TNA World Heavyweight title again. No, now a whole new class would have to rise to the forefront as Impact reached a new era in its history. An era which would see their profile drop to some of its lowest levels as they ended up bouncing around from smaller TV station to smaller TV station once they were kicked off Spike TV. Nevertheless, even if this was a major blow for the company, they persisted in hopes that things would eventually turn around again. And as they did this, they'd elevate new names to the top of the card when Eric Young, Bobby Lashley, EC3, Eddie Edwards, and Drew Galloway all won the world title. Hell, Young's big win would, like with AJ's last run, also ape a famous WWE storyline as this short, bearded mid-carder rising all the way up to the top in a true underdog story was very clearly a take on Daniel Bryan's Yes movement. But it wouldn't be the Canadian who was the most notable holder of the gold here during the mid to late 2010s, and it wouldn't even be future WWE champions in the aforementioned Bobby Lashley and Drew Galloway. Rather, it would be the man who got TNA more positive buzz than it had gotten in years by then, Broken Matt Hardy. That's right, while it might have seemed like something which was destined to fail on paper, Matt Hardy's outrageous cartoon portrayal of a wrestling villain here managed to get a lot of lapsed fans checking in on Impact again here, as for the first time in a long time again, it felt like it was starting to get an identity back as a more wacky promotion in the vein of a Chikara or a DDT. And in light of this mini revival in fortunes then, it would be in 2017 that the TNA World Heavyweight title was formally renamed the Impact Wrestling World Heavyweight title. Who would be the person holding this belt when the changeover happened? Well, that would be Bobby Lashley, but he wouldn't hold the gold for much longer here because it would be in July of 2007 that Alberto El Patron toppled the big man to become the new unified GFW World Heavyweight Champion. How had this sudden name change happened? Well, this was the period where Jeff Jarrett had returned to Impact, kind of. Basically, after leaving TNA in 2014, Double J had formed an all-new promotion called Global Force Wrestling. Something which, for a hot minute at least, looked like it might be something of note. Pretty quickly, however, it became clear that this was not going to be the case, and so that was why, in an attempt to make the most out of what he had, Jarrett would make a deal to work with Impact Wrestling in the summer of 2017, with this being the point that both companies' world titles were unified into one single championship, bearing the name of the brand which was deemed to have more value going forward. That said, it wouldn't keep the name of the unified GFW World Heavyweight Championship for long. No, over the coming months, the belt would change monikers multiple times, going from GFW Global Championship to Impact Global Championship to Impact World Championship by the time early 2018 came around, and it became clear Global Force Wrestling did not hold the value TNA thought it might when they first tried to do the rebrand in the wake of the merger. Needless to say then, this created a lot of confusion amongst fans as it became hard to tell what the world title in Impact even was anymore after a while. Hell, at points it wasn't even clear if it was still an Impact belt at all. But at least some new people would get to rise to the top of the card here, as in all the confusion about what the name of the gold was, Eli Drake, Pentagon Jr., Johnny Impact, Brian Cage, and Sami Callihan would each get their first runs with it. Of course, these were nothing in comparison to the person who would win the belt in 2020, however, as with Anthem Entertainment now owning Impact and its base of operations being moved up to Toronto, the new bosses decided to make history with their next top act. How would they do this? Well, by having Tessa Blanchard win the belt from Sami Callihan on July 12, 2020. Yes, for the first time ever, a woman had won the men's world title in the Impact Zone. As you can imagine then, this got another wave of buzz to surround the company and briefly made them something worth checking out again. Unfortunately though, this positive buzz would not last, and not just because the world would go into lockdown just 2 months later and stop any fans from attending shows for the foreseeable future. No, even more than that, it would be Tessa pretty much blackballing herself from the industry for a while, which forced Impact to have to rethink their world title scene, as on June 25th of that year, she'd formally be fired after missing a number of shows. As to what this meant for the Impact World Championship, well, that would be vacated with immediate effect, with a 5-way elimination match taking place at July 18th Slammiversary to crown a new champ. And once this one was over, it would be Eddie Edwards standing tall after successfully overcoming the challenge of Ace Austin, Trey Miguel, Rich Swann, and Eric Young. That said, while this was able to add some stability to Impact's top prize, the fact we were still deep in lockdown meant the troubles would be far from over for the company yet. No, over the next few months, with no ticket sales revenue coming in, and with them not having any kind of significant TV deal to rely on, TNA would be struggling to keep their head above water once more, as the belt eventually passed on to the likes of Eric Young and Rich Swann. And then a lifeline of sorts came in late 2020 and early 2021, as this was the point Impact began a working relationship with All Elite Wrestling. A relationship which would eventually see Kenny Omega himself win their world title as part of his belt collector gimmick. Yes, for the first time in their history, a non-TNA wrestler was holding the #1 belt in TNA. What would this do for the promotion's visibility? Well, while it didn't lead to a boom in business or anything, it certainly helped them greatly during an otherwise low time, as for several months throughout the spring and summer of 2021, the Impact World Championship would appear around the waist of one of the best wrestlers in the world during episodes of Dynamite on pretty much a weekly basis. Hell, at one point the belt would even be defended on AEW TV, when on the debut episode of Rampage on August 13th of that same year, the Best Bout Machine would defend against Christian Cage, with Christian Cage actually winning here. That's right, in another first, the Impact World title was now moving from one non-TNA contracted performer to another on a non-TNA show of all things. But while some might have seen this as a negative, others realized it was an invaluable way to gain more visibility for the Impact brand at this point in their history, and it all led to the company getting their belt back when at Bound for Glory a couple of months later on October 23rd, Josh Alexander would best the Instant Classic to start his first reign as world champion. Sadly for the walking weapon here though, this reign would last all of a few minutes because, after beating Christian, the new champ would be the victim of a Call Your Shot cash-in from Moose, a move which saw Moose actually leave the building that night with the gold around his waist. And he'd keep a hold of that belt for the next 182 days before Alexander eventually regained it. That's right, ultimately the title would return to the Canadian here, as he continued to push TNA forward into this new era now that the shutdown restrictions had fully been lifted, and during this period he'd prove to be another stabilizing force for the goal. Not that he'd be the only person to hold the belt in 2022 and 2023 though. Now, after going on a 335-day run on top, a record for this particular piece of hardware, the walking weapon would lose his goal. And unfortunately, he would lose it in the worst way possible because, rather than get beaten in the ring, a torn tricep would force him to vacate. So obviously then, Impact needed some new people to carry things while he was going to be out recovering. And this was what led to Steve Maclin and Alex Shelley both getting their own runs in the months which followed. And it was during Alex Shelley's run that another big change would happen for Impact Wrestling, as this was the point that then head booker of the show, Scott D'Amore, decided to brand the company as TNA again. So as a result of this, the Impact World Championship would once more become the TNA World Championship. That said, while this was another example of the promotion getting some brief positive buzz, that buzz would seemingly be squandered when D'Amore was ousted not long after this. As to what the world title was doing here, well, after moving back over to Moose for a while, it would find itself in the hands of Nick Nemeth. But in the end, Nemeth would only be keeping it warm for TNA's newest cult sensation. Who was this cult sensation? Well, that would be Joe Hendry, the man who, around this time, had gotten over huge with wrestling fans everywhere on account of his comedic singer-songwriter gimmick. Hell, so over had he gotten that he'd even managed to meme his theme song all the way to a high position on the UK download charts. Needless to say then, TNA bosses had taken full notice of this and had realized he was a guy with potential to take the promotion to another level, which was exactly why, in January of 2025, he'd become the new world champion. By this point though, it wasn't just Joe Hendry who was helping to give TNA a boost. No, there was also the fact that, to the surprise of many, WWE started a working relationship with the company here. One which would see Impact and NXT crossover regularly, to the point that they pretty much became a combined universe known as NXT&A. And this would mean that throughout 2025, the TNA World Championship would be a regular fixture on the developmental brand's TV. That said, even this wasn't the high point of the working relationship. No, the high point would come when at WrestleMania 41, Joe Hendry would make a surprise appearance while still TNA champ to challenge Randy Orton. Yes, the TNA World Championship appearing at the Showcase of the Immortals is something which would have been considered unthinkable only a couple of years prior. Seriously, never before in their history had Impact come close to having their top prize be shown in front of an audience of 60,000 people. But there it was, and the WWE-TNA relationship would continue to grow stronger as 2025 got going, and the top prize on Impact was taken away from Joe Hendry and instead moved over to Trick Williams. Yes, like with the AEW relationship a couple of years before, this partnership would see a member of the other company take the TNA World title. And now that Trick Williams was the champ, he'd be appearing on not just NXT TV with it on a regular basis, he'd also regularly defend at TNA pay-per-views. No matter who TNA put up against Williams for a while there though, no one was able to get the better of him. That was until someone did, because it was at Bound for Glory on October 12th that the WWE star was finally overcome when the new man who had presented himself as the face of Impact, Mike Santana, was able to best him in the middle of the ring. And it's Mike Santana who continues to hold the belt as of the time of this video's recording. How will his run be looked back on once it's finally over? That remains to be seen. But given how things are going, it's probably going to be one of the better remembered ones in the company's recent history. And that's important because let's not forget, this is one of 3 belts which continues to have a claim to the lineage going all the way back to George Hackenschmidt. So its continued success is of great value from a historical perspective and is a key piece of wrestling history.